So I've put several links to our to this afternoon's presentation, and we had a formal agenda, but we also have the list of items that we're going to be discussing in this particular meeting. So let's go turn to the link, and as a reminder, this is being recorded. Vivian is taking the role just based on who's in the meeting, so we're not doing a formal attendance. We're going to start off with our presentation on the budget update and discussion of priorities. So if we go to the first slide, we're going to be looking at current LCAP reporting and planning process. We're also going to be looking at our update on our spending capacity. Our focus in this meeting is the unrestricted general fund, but of course, we're also going to be looking at other funding sources, our LCAP and our BSEP. We then look at the revenue assumptions and multi-year projections for the unrestricted general fund. This was shared with the board at the last meeting. The difference in this presentation is that there's nothing input in the multi-year projections for any planned expenses, additional expenses. We have an interesting presentation on our COVID funds. We have an update on the current year COVID expenditures, permitted uses of the COVID funding, and also some slides on what we're planning on taking to the board tomorrow in terms of planned COVID expenses. A brief look at collective bargaining. And then 6 is a very involved process of us sharing with you staff's thinking of what we're thinking about. It's pre-engagement, so now after this it will be after engagement, but staff's work to build on board priorities. So that's a pretty extensive list. That list was shared with you earlier. I think Vivian shared that link with you, and she also shared what we called our COVID tool, our COVID-19 tool, which is a comprehensive look at all COVID funding, the expiration dates, the uses, and the balances that we have available to us. Any questions on the on what we're trying to get to today, or okay, so Brent, did you want to kind of lead us off with the LCAP reporting and the planning process, and then also the overall our overall approach for looking at our budget for next year?
I'm happy to do that. I've got the traffic noises of University Avenue behind me, so there may be a little bit of noise. Is everybody comfortable sort of looking at the slide deck on your own screen? Everybody's got it there. I won't bother then to share my screen. You can see where we are. So I'm going to jump over to slide 4. It is the slide that says looking forward. And this is just meant sort of ever so briefly just to talk a little bit about our context. You know, we've got lots of moving pieces in this budget building season. And it does include, really importantly, the construction of a new 3-year LCAP. That's the Local Control Accountability Plan. This is really meant by the state of California to serve as the sort of strategic planning template for districts here in the state. So I laid out in what I hope is an accessible way just the sort of basic elements of that LCAP plan. It does include, looking at data, identifying areas of growth and weakness. It also includes then identifying goal statements, the job of the board to approve those goals. And then for us ultimately to think about, what are the actions that get us to those goals, and how will we measure our progress to know if we've actually accomplished those goals. So this isn't anything new. The template has been around since 2014, but I did want to sort of, put this particular budget cycle in the context of writing a new 3-year plan. And it just sort of adds one more moving part to what is already a complicated process as we build our district budget. So with that, I'll just continue on and try to give the committee a sense of how we're approaching the order of operations in this particular budget cycle. And they're there's a lot of moving parts. So I just like to kind of go through it. So I'm going to move over to slide 5. And so the first thing that we're doing is just to sort of stick with a couple of key budgeting assumptions. These assumptions are really derived from what we think are enrollment projections for the coming couple of years. It is right now the case that students are re-enrolling, families are coming to the enrollment office, getting their applications into us. We believe that we may be on our way to at least a partial recovery of our student enrollment. And we're going to pay close attention to student enrollment over the course of the next 6 to 8 weeks, because it will matter a lot how many students we enroll. That really drives our revenue. But for now, for the next 6-week period up until about mid-May, I guess that's about a 5-week period, we're really wanting to sort of stick with the assumption that we could have a -7% drop in enrollment for the coming year, and then sort of do all of our budget forecasting predicated on that -7% enrollment. So again, I want to be totally transparent. We don't think we're heading towards -7%. We think we're going to recover about half of the drop of enrollment. But for the time being, out of caution, we'd like to build all of our revenue estimates on this -7% and revise when we have data from our round 2 enrollments. That I think is sort of a conservative stance for us to adopt. So while we wait for enrollment figures to come in, enrollment data from round 2, we also have a couple of other moving pieces to be thinking about. All of our CBAs, collective bargaining agreements, are coming to a close this year. That's true for our teachers as well as our classified staff and our 2 administrative unions. We're at the end of a 2-year contract cycle, and so we know that we're going to go back to the table. And while we don't know sort of what the cost implications of bargaining will be, it's important that we keep in mind that we will be bargaining, and that it is part of the overall sort of fiscal landscape as we plan for our plan for next year. So that's kind of a question mark, and we just want to flag it as a question mark that we don't yet understand from the district's budget perspective what will come from our time at the table, but it's there. Then jumping over to slide 6, just to sort of take it in this order. While we're waiting for enrollment, while we're sort of working through, through the bargaining table with our labor partners, there's some other things that we will be doing. That includes data analysis, looking at all of the outcome data that we have available to us, as well as other indicators to get a sense of, what do we invest in, what do we want to change, essentially fulfilling the compliance requirement of the LCAP about identifying strengths and weaknesses. So we'll continue to do that even as we're sort of waiting. Number 4 then is that we will, as we always do, continue to move forward our BSTEP budget. This is what's called the Program and Oversight Committee. This is the team. Nicole is a representative of that group that takes care of the roughly 1/3 of our district dollars that come from BSEP and BARA. And so the P&O has been reviewing budget proposals. They in fact approved 9 different budgets just last week, and those budgets will be going to the board tomorrow evening for review and approval, I anticipate. So we will be doing that work while we wait for enrollment figures, while we're waiting for the bargaining. And then we also will be bringing to the board a selected set of expenditures from our one-time funding, from COVID funds. And these selected set of expenditures will first be the ones that are most time sensitive, that could involve staffing up for a period of time. And so there's an example of this also tomorrow evening. We'll be bringing a couple recommendations to the board for approval from COVID funding. They include 3 things: temporary expansion of the BREA department to include a data analyst position, a one-time allocation of COVID funds to our school sites. We're calling that a restorative restart grant for our schools. And then also a 2-year pilot of a 7-period day at Longfellow Middle School. So that is sort of another moving part. We'll continue to move that forward, again, while we're waiting for enrollment data. And then last but not least is commitments to the general fund. And again, we've sort of signaled that those kinds of commitments would begin to move to the board only after we've collected more firm enrollment data. So we're really talking about late May and into June, where we would start to make commitments, both to the general fund, and then I should also say the supplemental fund, or what we often call the LCAP fund. So I share all of that just to sort of say that there is a particular order that we're going to take our budget in this year. There's a particular order in which committees will be engaged and in which the board will be engaged in making approvals. So I'll pause there and see if there are any questions just about process, and then we're going to jump into some more of the numbers. And Matt, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Stevens. This is just a process question. I understand that there are 3 items going to the board tomorrow. I'm just wondering, I know this aspect time has not worked for my current schedule this winter. But I'm wondering what has been the process to land on those 3 items, and also the amount of those 3 items. I'm not too concerned with the one-time money, but at some point, right, it will matter. And also, I know that we're having a meeting next week with a lot of educators on weighing in on some of these decisions and why these things are coming before that meeting.
Yeah, 2 really good questions. So I do have some slides about each of these, but just very quickly, the school grant program, we're calculating at about $1.8 million. And the sort of details is that it's a $150 allocation per student per school, as well as an additional $150 per pupil allocation for unduplicated students. And all told, that adds up to $1.8 million that will come from multiple COVID relief fund categories. We'll show you that in a minute. Then we have at a cost of roughly $130 with benefits, a data analyst position. Again, we're thinking sort of surge capacity. And then the Longfellow proposal is sort of maxed out right now at $200,000 for each of the 2 years. Now, I don't know that that's the actual cost, but that's the figure that we're bringing to the board tomorrow as I think the outer edge of the costs.
Okay, and so we think that that is potentially a maximum cost, or?
We think right now, and we understand that we've got work to do on the Longfellow sort of model. So we're bringing this to the board now versus May 5th because we wanted to signal very clearly that there is a financial commitment to do it, even though we've got a lot of planning in front of us.
And I'll just speak from my position here. It does change the contract, as you are aware, going to a 7th period day, and it could have other financial implications that we don't know yet until we sit down and talk. So I do understand this is going to the board tomorrow, but it's just hard for me to understand how the board can approve it without knowing the cost.
Yeah, I think the board is interested in both setting aside the money and then sending the signal that, it is the 7 period day at Longfellow is hardly a new topic. It's been one that's, sort of resurfaced annually for quite a long time, but hasn't sort of moved in any particular direction. So this is, the board's intent to send a signal that it's both willing to commit financially and then sort of create a different kind of playing field for talking about the planning.
Okay.
So that's the rationale.
Thanks.
Everybody else okay just on process? So far so good? All right, fantastic. And then moving along. So why don't I've got to back myself up, I apologize. So Pauline, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you and we'll just do what I think is a pretty quick review of the multi-year projections, sort of revenue assumptions. I think this is sort of not new to SBAC members, so we'll probably move pretty quickly through it.
Okay, thanks, Brent. So we're going to look at slide 10. And again, this is our budget scorecard that we've shared with the board. And we are now sharing with you in terms of the general fund, LCAP, BSEP, and the COVID relief fund. So when we look at the general fund, we are anticipating an additional $3.3 million in expenses. But when you're looking at what we're going to be spending, there's a link here, other sources and uses. If you click on that link, that takes you to a spreadsheet that looks at what we're doing in 2021 versus 21-22 in terms of our other sources and uses. So in the past, we just looked at revenue and expenses, but this is a pretty important slide in terms of additional costs that we're looking at in 21-22. So if everybody opens that link, we can take a look at the at that spreadsheet. Oh, so does do you not have access? Does everybody have access to view the other sources and uses?
Yeah, it opened for me.
It opened for you?
I
It
do
said,
not have access.
Probably if you have a BUSD.
Yeah,
Brent,
I
do you
set
do you
up
mind? You can.
.NET.
Who hasn't it opened for?
I'm also having trouble just loading this file, Pauline.
Oh,
Pauline, for myself, it said I had to request access. It might be, I don't have a berkeley.net email. I don't know if that's impacts it.
okay. I'll share my screen. I think it may be easier just to do that. Can everybody see this now? Okay, so this is our other sources and uses, and this came from our 2021 second interim. So you can see we're just looking at 2021, 21, 22, and 22, 23. So I just want to point out that in 2021, we were using one-time funds, $3.2 million.
I followed the recipe and Mary encouraged me to make it.
We have a little bit of interruptions. Okay, so so this $3.2 million,
Ask grandma. You like
this $3.2 million is actually one time. So you see it doesn't transfer over in 21, 22, or 22, 23. Or we are expecting no change to our contribution to our self-insurance fund. But in our cafeteria fund, in 2021, due to the lack of reimbursable meals and COVID expenses and reduced revenue, we actually contributed $1.3 million to the cafeteria fund. In 2020, 21-22, we're expecting this amount to go back to the normal level, 600 to 700,000. We're estimating $600,000. So there's a savings there, even though we've lost the $3.2 million in our transfer from the post-employment benefit fund. BSEP we're keeping pretty steady because we're not adjusting the cost of teachers or number of teachers needed. So we're just keeping that flat and kind of looking at the projections for the out year. And for special ed, you can see that in 2021, we're anticipating one-time expenses of $1 million. So our contribution goes from 25.2 million down to $24.2 million. So as a result, instead of us spending $8.1 million in 21-22, we're spending $9.5 million. So that impacts our bottom line and that impacts our change in our fund balance. So we can't just look at revenue and expenses, which is what we tend to do. We have to look at the overall change to fund balance. Any questions on that?
So Pauline, can you just help me? So basically what we're looking at is, these are all kind of internal transfers, right? They're
Correct.
moving sort of into the general fund and out of the general fund. Money coming into the general fund is BSEP.
Right.
And then money going out of the general fund is going into other, from an accounting perspective, it's going into other funds in the district that pay for district programs, but that are nonetheless debited from the general fund, right?
Correct. And the contributions as well to special ed.
Mm-hmm.
So other funds as well as other programs in the general fund.
And then can you help us understand, because I think what I'm seeing in 21-22 is actually decreased spending on special ed. but
Right.
nonetheless, there's increased spending from the general fund. Can you sort of unpack that for us?
Right. So what's driving that predominantly is this one-time transfer in that we had from Fund 20, the $3.2 million. We don't have the benefit of that transfer in to the general fund in 21, 22 or 22, 23. So that 3.2 million is actually is helping the general fund in 2021. And then what's also helping the general fund in 21, 22, we're reducing the contribution to the cafeteria fund. So if you look at the change from one year to the other, we're losing 3.2 million. We're gaining about $700,000 here. We're gaining $1 million. So the net impact is $1.5 million more that we have to contribute, largely driven by the fact that we don't have the benefit of the $3.2 million in 2021. Does that help? Or
Yeah,
do
thank
we
you.
need-
And I do think that there's a couple more questions about other funds and uses or other
of the sources and uses?
other sort of, yeah, and I think I see Matt's hand and maybe a couple others.
Okay, Matt, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I'll leave the meeting early, don't worry, and I'll stop talking. So I have two things. One thing is just for clarity, I think what we are going to consider that $3,200,000 in a way in the out years, it's kind of a reduction, right? Because it was, and it doesn't look like that on this chart, but it was revenue in a way that came in for 1 year and is then disappearing. So I think that helps everyone understand that there's a drop. We never cut our spending, right? We just use that to fill a hole where we could have made a cut. And so the 3.2 is actually, it's just money that stopping coming in. So
Yeah.
I think that helps make the numbers make more sense, that we're losing a $3.2 million contribution. I think that's
Correct.
what we'll leave it
Yeah.
at. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is just a weird question, just like as this meeting is happening, I get an email from EdSource talking about how the USDA is reimbursing for school lunches 100% of a certain, I think, of the free and reduced, and you have to have a waiver. And I know that we overspent 1.3 million and we're spending 600,000. So I'm just wondering, how does this kind of support play into this line item very specifically, where it seems like there is money available from the feds? Was that taken into account? Did we apply for 2021? Is it too late to put our numbers in to reduce this number? And then, or is this the number when after we did that? And then in 21, 22, what basically this article is saying that this program is going to be extended through 2022.
Right. So I think what Matt is talking about is the seamless summer option.
Yes, exactly.
And that's actually a way that we can deliver meals. It just means that we don't need to do as much paperwork to deliver meals to our students. We kind of have a checklist, and students can get both lunch and they can get breakfast in terms of the way we offer the program, offer meals to our students. What this is showing is that the number of meals that we're actually serving, even though we're trying to get meals to our families where they can come by and pick it up, the number of meals that we're serving is actually a lot less than it usually is. So that 1,300,000, it's actually an increase. We usually give the meals for the needy, which is about $700,000 to the program. We elected to keep the funding for, even though it's unrestricted, it's in the general fund, we've elected to keep its use for nutrition services. So this is actually about a $500,000 increase. And this is based on our projections. We're doing our meal counts. And this is what we are projecting that it needs to keep the nutrition services program balanced for 2021 in light of the impact of COVID-19. So when we close the books, this is our budget that we're looking at now. When we actually close the books, we'll have the actual amounts that's needed. So it may be higher, it may be lower, but right now this is our best guess in terms of what we need to support our nutrition services program to keep them balanced. And we're projecting $600,000 for 21, 22, and the out years, which is a little bit less. And that's because the rate has gone up, and we're projecting that we would go back to pre-pandemic levels in terms of the number of meals served in 21, 22. So
Thanks.
any other questions? I can't see any other hands. Okay, so I'll stop sharing this slide. And I think if it's easier, I can share. Is everybody seeing the scorecard now in my shared drive in the screen?
You stopped sharing, Pauline, so you'll have to,
Oh,
yeah, you'll have to
of
reshare.
course. Hold on. I'm not sure what you're going to get. All right, here, I think this should be it. Okay, so I'm sharing again, and now we should see this scorecard, right? Correct? I'm going to assume that's a yes. So I started off sharing the overall impact to the general fund. So this $3.3 million minus the 4, of which the sources and uses are actually included in that. Our decreased student enrollment does not impact. There's no impact in 21, 22, and I'll share a slide with you that goes into more detail. So we have new revenue, 3.3. We're expecting increase in expenses and other sources and uses, impact of other sources and uses of 4 million. So that means that the general fund is deficit spending by $700,000. So we really have a negative $700,000 balance when we're looking at new expenses for 21, 22. In a similar way, LCAP, they're looking at a negative balance of $978,000. BSEP, Natasha is here. There is an increase in revenue, a cost increase. They are planning on deficit spending by $130,000. And available in Measure A, which is one-time revenue, is the previous measure, there's $171,000. So, and of course, our COVID relief funds, one time, it's $16 million before we look at the expenses that we're taking to the board tomorrow. So it's going to be closer to $13 million after we look at proposed expenses. So this is the whole picture in terms of where we're starting off before even considering additional costs. So this scorecard is always handy to keep in mind in terms of if we put any additional costs in any of these programs besides COVID, we're expecting that we would need an equal dollar reduction to balance our budgets. So on the next slide, we're going to look at our revenue assumptions, and I've shared a version of this several times now, and I think this probably just kind of brings it home to everybody just in terms of what we're looking at and what from this year to next year. So our enrollment, we talked about the cliff, the 7%. We are projecting the 7% reduction, as Brent explained earlier. And we would be adjusting this as needed as we look at the round 2 of our accounts in later in May. And we're projecting that same level of enrollment in 22-23. Our unduplicated pupil counts, it went from 2743 down to 2551. That's a projection. And then our unduplicated pupil percentage, this is an average that's used in our LC our LCFF calculator, which is used to determine our base funding and our supplemental funding. So we're going from 30.6 down to 28.8. And further down to 27.86, and that's because it's a rolling average. And this impacts our supplemental funding, and that you'll see the impact of this when we look at our multi-year projections. And then our ADA, this is an interesting line item because it looks at our funded ADA. So this is how we're going to be actually paid. So you can see in 21-22, we are going to be paid the higher of current year or prior year. So we have the benefit of 1 year for 2021, we can actually be funded at the 94.26 level. And then we're going to see a decrease both in funded and projected ADA in 22-23, which we've been calling the cliff year. So our projected ADA, you can see in 21-22, even though the projected ADA is 87.66, we do have the benefit of being funded at the higher level 94.26, sorry. And then our COLA, the Department of Finance and School Services, we've all landed on 3.84% for 21-22. But you may remember I brought our assumptions for 22-23, which is our cliff year. This is the average of the Department of Finance's number and school services. We've landed somewhere in the middle, and we will get more information with the May revise so we can shore up that number either more or less, hopefully more, as we get more information. So this is the key to understanding our assumptions, our revenue assumptions for the unrestricted general fund. So once we're all aware of what's going on here, it will explain the numbers when you actually see them on further slides. Do I have any questions before I move on?
Pauline, I know you can't see everybody. I think Matt's got his hand up, and I see Robin as well.
Okay, so why don't we take Robin first, and then we can take. I can't see everybody. You're right.
Thank you. If you could go to the slide immediately before this one. Can you, I'm not understanding that negative $1 million number in the LCAP column. Where does that come from?
I am not absolutely sure. We looked at the increase in costs, and I think this is the impact of the decreased students and the unduplicated counts in LCAP. I think the overall, I think there has been a there've been deficit spending for some time, and then the further impact of the increased students. This is from LCAP's calculations, but it has to do with the cost increases as well as the decreased students for enrollment and decreased funding. So this is the student, is that right, Brent?
Yeah, I think you've got 2/3 of it. So there's actually 2 fiscal years reflected in this particular negative dollar value. So the first is this current fiscal year, 2021. So we're running about a $280,000 deficit in our current supplemental budget spending. And the reason for that is that we certify our unduplicated pupil count in January of each year. And then the state adjusts our allocation for the supplemental grant immediately following that certification. So it's a very awkward timing issue, but in effect, we built our budget on one assumption and got a mid-year correction in terms of our certified unduplicated pupil count. So that's about roughly $300,000.
Okay.
And then we move over to fiscal year 21-22, where we've got 2 things going on. One is cost increases associated with all the personnel funded in that budget. And then there's the 284 students that we're anticipating will not be counted as unduplicated students next year, and that leads to decreased revenue. So it's sort of those 3 elements, 2 fiscal years worth of declining unduplicated student enrollment, and then increased cost, and that all told comes out to $978,000.
Thank you.
Yep.
Matt?
So $8 million of cuts is, unprecedented in our district. And I don't think we're going to have the luxury of some of our bailout mechanisms that we maybe have had in the past, because we've used them, because the measure is at its end. There's various reasons. So mine's really just a process question. This group that is convening right now, it seems like we are going to need to be very active to be thinking about $8 million and what that means. I'm just wondering, we know that these decisions really need to be made really by like February because of teacher template and hiring and all these things of next year for 22-23. So I'm just wondering from a process perspective, if we can get some buckets of ideas before this year is over. Because I think even if we start in September, I mean, we've spent a lot, we've had a lot of meetings to talk about $1.5 million of cuts. Right? So I'm just a little bit concerned on our process, and to make sure that we all have a lot of time, because we're going to need to all talk to our constituencies a lot about what this means in 22-23. So it's just a plug for starting to think about what that may look like before this year is over.
Yeah, it's a point really well made, Matt. In fact, by the time we finish today's session and get through these slides, I think it'll probably be apparent that there is, really no opportunity for increased spending this year without commensurate cutting to the budget. I do think that we're gonna, by the time we finish this year's budget, we will be talking about reductions in spending. And then you're right, 22-23, we're going to need the entire year to prep for some scenario. I have a feeling it's another cutting scenario. Now that $8 million, please keep in mind, is based on it's the most conservative estimate of our enrollment. It's really the doomsday that we're sort of staring at in that particular MYP. But I think it's really good for this committee and all of us to keep in mind that even though we may not need that many cuts, we're very likely staring at some sort of cuts that come from decreased enrollment because of the pandemic.
Thanks.
Yep. Yeah, I think you got it just right.
Okay. Nicole?
Nicole, you're muted.
And I'm muted. There we go. I did it again. Okay, great. You'd think after a whole year of this thing, right? So I guess my question is very similar to Matt's, but I started thinking about it in a different way, which is the fact that, under a worst case scenario, if we have 7% fewer students, there are obviously some savings, right? There's some economies of scale that you have to happen, right? And so, at some point, I guess, when we do go through this process for the next 10 months or whatever, I guess, there's an aspect of it where I think it'd be helpful to identify what those are, however you name them, right? There's some things that we don't have if we have 7% fewer students, if that makes sense. We don't need to operate the same number of X and Y and whatever it's going to be. So I don't know. There's some of that comes naturally, and then there's some of that where it's identified. I don't know how to, it's not a good way to say it, but I was trying to understand when we start to identify those choices, I guess. And I guess thinking about it, it is exactly now through the fall and into the early part of 2022, right?
We could need that much time. Yeah. So I do think that we won't get through this budget season without talking about some kind of reductions. And then next year, I think Matt's point is we're going to need a very long time once we understand our enrollment projections with a bit more data, we're going to need a lot more time to understand exactly what the impact of the decreased enrollment will be. Some of it naturally means that there will be, fewer classrooms. I mean, that's one natural consequence. And that probably will flow, but then there's a lot of values-based decisions about where we would choose to cut versus retaining staff.
Mhm.
challenge like in our organization, like every other school district, we are 85% staff, if not higher. And so any decision about reductions
Exactly.
naturally involves the people we employ. And so
Yeah.
it makes it very difficult.
Mm.
Dan added a comment in the chat. 700 fewer students would need teachers, and that's about 4 to 5 million. Dan, did you want to kind of? Oh, I guess not. Natasha?
Well, similar point to Dan's, the savings when our enrollment goes down, the savings accrue primarily to the general fund, not so much to BSEP. Just looking at the teacher template for this year for the year we're in compared to next year, which does include a decrease in enrollment. BSEP still picks up about the same number of FTE because we sort of pick up the above and beyond numbers and just how the calculations pencil out, but the savings mostly accrue to the general fund. I also wanted to just say that in terms of plans for BSEP, and Pauline, I apologize, the number that's in there, the deficit spending 130, that's for this current year because we had not yet through the P&O committee approved this year's plan, but it's now 614.
Ooh.
Actually 615, let's call it. We'll round it up.
Yeah.
And that's, remember, drawing down on a very significant fund balance,
Fund
3.2 million. However, we do not want to get into the situation that we were in. I think Matt alluded to it
Okay.
with Measure A, where there were a lot of things that the district wanted that BSEP was able to carry during a period when we had higher COLAs and the district did not. So one of the things that I've done with this year's BSEP plans is include in them notes about the amount of reductions that may be necessary to make over the next 3 years as we go into the end of this current measure, which is sunsets in 24-25. So we do want to get to a balanced budget for BSEP. It's nice to buy things that we can right now with our fund balance, but we do want to try to get to a balanced budget so that we're not going out hat in hand to the voters, asking them not only to renew BSEP, but to increase it. I don't think we can do that. So we're trying to do that in all of our categories of BSEP.
Okay. Thanks, Natasha. We'll have to get this slide updated. Okay, if there are no more questions and I can't see everybody's hands, I'm gonna move us on to the next slide. So we had talked about that. So this is just to reiterate what we were talking about in terms of using the 7% enrollment projections, the reduction of 7%. And we talked about revising that after May 16th, round 2 of the enrollment deadline and after the May revise from the state. Then we looked at the multi-year projections. The revenue has not changed. The assumptions are listed here. Again, the COLA, these are estimates. Averages actually for 22-23 and 23-24, our ADAs per the previous slides, and our UPP, the actual count is listed here. Our base funding, you can see that we're reducing our base funding from 21-22 down to by 400,000 here, just as a result of the reduction in our unduplicated pupil count and the combination of our COLA. So these numbers come directly from our LCFF calculator, which is a Department of Finance tool that we use. So we're looking at 100.4 million in 21-22, 95.9 in 22-23, and then 98 million in 23-24. And on the next slide, this is what Matt was alluding to in terms of budget reductions needed for the cliff year. So we're looking at $9 million in cuts, of which 8 million is ongoing. And remembering that any increases here, because we're barely balanced, we're actually, we do have a positive ending fund balance, and we're not even clearing all our designations. But with deficit spending $1.7 million, whatever we add here, we have to make equal and opposite budget reductions or increases in revenue. So this is just the bare bones without any additional costs. There are various versions kind of floating around, and Dr. Stevens had mentioned salary increases. Any negotiated salary increases will require additional reductions. So anything that's put into the budget, any of these areas are going to need equal and opposite or an additional budget reduction. Any questions on that? Okay, so this just kind of summarizes where we are and what our roadmap is in terms of what our challenges are in terms of looking at our enrollment. We talked about the whole harmless. This is just an explanation of what we're looking at when we're coming up with our multi-year. We talked about the cliff, and we do have a lot of one-time revenue, which we're going to take a look at in a little bit more detail. And of course, we talked about bargaining or bargaining units and what we had as raises in the prior year. And in the following slides, you'll see the impact of 1%. What is an 1%? It's actually $1.1 million to the unrestricted general fund, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. And this is just to summarize, our COLA does not cover existing expenses. We have to reduce $1 million in LCAP, and then we're rewriting the new. So this is an overall summary of what we talked about. And of course, highlighted here, additional general fund, any additional costs must be matched by an equal amount of budget reductions. So this is just an update on our overall spending. We have a little bit more detail in terms of how much we've spent to date, but this is just a look at what we have spent money on since the last time we kind of shared with the public. We're looking at additional contract for sports for learning, our stipends for in-person instruction. We've written a lot of MOUs. And this is our number from HR in terms of the overall cost. This number may go up. We'll revise it. This is our best estimate at this time. Lifelong needed additional staffing. We needed additional funding for our hotspots. Communications requested an increase in contracts as a result of COVID. They're spending a lot more time with communications. And then we hired additional nursing for COVID testing. That's 180. And this is just an overview of some of the things we're spending or funding on. And this next slide, I'm probably going to have Brent discuss this. This is going to the board tomorrow. So Brent, if you want to discuss these slides, that would be great.
Yeah, I in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend much time on it. I responded to a question by Matt about 3 sort of COVID related expenses we're bringing to the board. So the first idea is just to move some dollars to our schools so that they can spend on student supports. That's what we're calling the Restorative Restart School Grant. Next slide, pilot project to try out a 7-period day at Longfellow. And then a temporary addition of a classified data analyst position to Brea as we begin to establish metrics for the next 3-year LCAP. So those are sort of 3 examples of additional expenses we're moving to the board in addition to the ones that Pauline just showed on the previous slide. So I'm happy to answer questions, but I kind of talked a little bit about those things earlier.
Okay. So on this next slide, this is
sorry.
oh, sorry.
Can we just,
go ahead.
Natasha, I see your hand is up and
I can't see, sorry.
That's okay.
That's a leftover hand. Apologies. I'll
It's
take
a
it.
leftover.
Oh, okay. It's a leftover. Okay. I just have, I can only see like a very thin sliver of everybody who's on this call. So this tracking tool, this actually came from school services, and I'm going to open the link. It's a very, and this was actually shared in the, I think Vivian sent this out with the agenda. So this is a lot of information, but it's essential that we all take a look at our various funding sources, and this is opening up pretty, it's taking a while. So this is really tiny, but you guys can open it on your screen as well. And what we wanted to do was to look at all our funding sources for COVID. It looks at whether we have to pay an indirect cost on these funds. There are links to the various apportionment schedules from the CBE. And it's also a little blurb on how are these funds determined and how are they going to be allocated? Are they using Title I, or what's the basis for allocation? There's a laundry list of uses, and this is extremely important. Every time we're thinking of COVID funds, we don't have all the information with us at once. Row 4 is significant because it tells us when we have to use the funds. And then, of course, rows, I think 10 through all the way down through 25 tells us what we can use these funds on. So it's essential that we all look at this one-time funding. What can it be used on? There's no mention when it comes to the ESSER fundings. ESSER fund, resource 3210, 3212, and to be determined. We have 3 ESSER funds. That's the least restrictive. And I want to call your attention to the amount, the text in red, and I'm not sure if I can make this any bigger. I don't think I can. But this talks about other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation and continuity of services in districts or school districts, and to continue the employment of their existing staff. So in most of the meetings I've been in with CBOs, this is a caveat that people are kind of using in terms of trying to transfer existing costs to these one-time funding. And you can see the ESSER 3 actually goes until September 30th, 2024. ESSER 2 through September 23. And this is one area that a lot of districts are looking at in terms of relieving existing funds by a particular dollar amount. That's so for instance, transferring salaries and benefits for a particular period, and then that would make funds available for other funding sources to be able to accommodate all the other additional expenses. So very quickly, we can see just looking at all our funding sources, what we've spent. We have the detail of what we've spent, and that I can share that with you on another slide, but just in the interest of time, in terms of looking at all the funding sources, what we've spent and the balance, if we go all the way over to column N, this is a great summary. So there's an additional $311,000 in indirect costs. We've spent actually $8.2 million to date. The total funding that we had, and this is just from federal and state, $24.8 million. We have a balance of $16.3 million. But as Brent mentioned, we're taking to the board the Restorative Restart grant, that's $2 million. The 7th day period, that's $200,000. And then the data integration specialist in Brer, that's 130. So that's going to leave us 13.9, close to $14 million in one-time spending that can be spent on these various purposes and within that timeline. So it's a balancing act. We have to look at allowable uses. We have to look at when the funding expires, and we just have to make sure that we're we're in compliance with all of the requirements. There's a lot of reporting requirements as well to ascertain some of these funds. The AB 86, the expanded learning grant, those expire in August 22, and they're for specific purposes. The in-person instruction grant, that's the least restrictive. And then there's a requirement that we set aside 10% of our grants for our staffing, or temporary staffing. And that should be, somehow my screen is frozen. So did everybody get a chance to look at this? This is a lot of information, but it's relevant to our process. So it's really a good summary. I thought that everyone would benefit from getting this information. Do we have any questions?
I have one, Pauline. I'm sorry, I can't find my raise your hand button on my computer. Are these documents all in the group folder on the shared drive?
Yes, I asked Vivian to put this in the shared drive,
Okay.
and I'll make
Okay.
sure it's accessible to everybody.
Great.
So, and I think it was also in the agenda that she shared. So this is going to be our COVID-19 tool. We have another spreadsheet that tracks all our expenses, and there's a way that we request if you want use of funds, there's a special format. So I'm working closely with Michelle Bajé Sulao. We meet about these funds on a regular basis. Any other questions? Wow, that went quickly. I thought we were going to be here for a while. Okay, so this is the summary. We talked about ESSER3. It's the least restricted, and we talked about when it expired. And then this next section is it's an approach that we're thinking of, transferring general fund expenses 1 or more years to ESSER3 as a way to relieve the general fund and for savings. So that's pretty straightforward. Collective bargaining. This is just a summary of what the impact of a 1% raise. What does it do to the general fund? And of course, BSEP and LCAP are also impacted. So a 1% raise, modest raise, and a 1% one time, we would have in the first year 2.2 impact to the unrestricted general fund, and then 1.1 in ongoing. So in the first year, we'd have 1.1, that's a one-time bonus, and then 1.1 ongoing. So 2.2 the first year and 1.1 ongoing. And similarly, there's a 2% raise and a 2% one-time, or a 3% raise or a 3% one-time. So Nicole, you have a question? You're muted. Oh, sorry.
It's actually back on your slide 23, the concept of using the ESSER3. So thank you for that spreadsheet. It is, I like spreadsheets, but that's a head scratcher. That's a lot of data in there. So thank you for that.
That's why we shared it early.
Woo. I can't imagine having to work with that thing. And I like a good spreadsheet, but so I completely understand the concept of using that kind of longer term fund, right? But at the end of the day, isn't that kind of a little bit kicking the can down the road?
Right. So we're trying to find like one-time expenses would be the perfect. If we had one-time expenses that we could use one-time funding, that would be perfect. But what I'm going to be sharing with you the various ideas that we also shared earlier in terms of what we're looking at, what's one time, what's a good fit, probably what's not as good a fit, you know, and of course, some of the expenses we're looking at, they're pandemic related expenses. So that would lend itself to one-time expenses. Okay. So we can take a deeper dive at at what we're looking at. Okay. So, any other hands that I can't see? No other hands? Okay, so any questions on collective bargaining? Okay, so now we're getting into looking at possible additional investments. And I actually have a link to what we have been thinking about. The budget team, we've met on several occasions. We keep meeting. We've come up with a list of possible expenses in 21, 22. This is the link. And I also have them listed on the following slides. So you can either open the link or look at the following slides. And these cover a variety of areas. And again, this is with the caveat that, you know, if we add expenses, unless we're looking at COVID funding as a one-time relief, we're going to have to implement budget cuts. So Brent, did you want me to go through these, or did you want to, or how do you want us to present this?
You know, we've been talking quite a bit. It might make a little bit of sense to let everybody open the spreadsheet. A lot of the ideas are self-explanatory. We might
Okay.
sort of just give everybody a little narrative about how to read it. The one thing that I would offer is, you know, in keeping with the slides that we just described, we do understand that as we talk about possible new expenses, we also have like a corresponding list of possible cuts that we need to put together. That's the one thing that we really hope you'll take away from this presentation, is that we're not in a situation to spend a lot of money without cutting a lot of money. And it really is almost a dollar for dollar trade at this point. So please sort of keep that in mind as you're looking at this. This is not preparation for a spending spree. It really is just trying to keep in track a lot of the ideas that we've been listening to in parent advisory committees, board meetings, and other places. In the event that we do have opportunities to spend, we have a list, but we need to prioritize it and then think about how we'll pay for it.
So before we open the link, actually slide 32 has, oh, you can hardly read that, I'm sorry. What we actually did, we looked at areas, we looked at math and science. These are just overall areas, and behind each of these areas, we have several proposals. So we looked at math and science, and we were thinking that additional expenses of $255,000 will actually assist our math and science program, and this is a proposed funding. So LCAP will be relieved by 195. BSEP's HQI will be picking up the 195, as well as an additional student support of $60,000. So you would have to open up the entire deck, but this is just an overall of the total areas that we're looking at, and the totals do not include the $2 million that we're taking to the board tomorrow, or the Braille analyst, or the seventh period. I think I got them all out. So it's a moving target. So why don't we open the link, and I will let everyone just to explain how it works again. The total transaction, math and science, we can see that these are the various proposals that we have, and the columns to the right of column B is the proposed funding source, or if there will be savings. Natasha kind of did a color coding thing, which we looked at new expenses, a resource swap. I'm not sure if we kept that convention throughout the entire thing, but this is the overall our overall thinking. So for instance, our math and coach is a $60,000 investment. The net impact is actually zero, because LCAP is giving up that math coach that BSEP student support will be picking up. So why don't I give you some time to look at this in detail. It's quite extensive, and there are copies of the other slides. Copies of these slides are also follow this this slide. So I'll let you look at that, and then let's put, how much time do you think, Brent? Like 10
well,
minutes?
Why don't we check in 5? I don't know. Likely it's in 5 minutes, folks are going to begin to make sense of what's here. It may make sense to just answer some preliminary questions. And then if a little bit more, sort of exploration time is needed, we can take it.
Okay, all right. I'll put 5 minutes on the clock. So we're at 5 minutes. Do you guys need a little bit more time, or are we ready to?
I'm seeing at least one question. Why don't we pause here and just sort of check to see how this is looking? Denise, I saw your hand go up, and then we'll check for other questions as well. Hi, Denise.
Hi everybody.
Hi,
Yeah,
Denise.
do you hear me?
Yes.
Just fine.
Okay.
We're a little jealous you're outside, but go ahead.
I know, like I'm so happy my kids are playing by themselves. I'm overseeing somewhere. Okay, so anyway, I had a question in March. There was a tentative position for the EL master plan overseeing of implementation, and this proposal have several positions about EL. So can you explain a little bit more your thinking behind what you are proposing for English learners?
I can, sure. Denise is referring to a consultant position that we are continuing to look for, actually. The board had set aside a relatively modest sum back in January to begin looking for a consultant to help us revise the EL master plan, the English Learner Master Plan. We did a initial request for proposals. We actually have not succeeded in finding the right consultant. And so we're beginning that search again now. We are working with a number of community partners to do that search, and we hope to find somebody soon. So that's sort of one expense. And then you see a number of additional English learner sort of support expenses as ideas on the spreadsheet. They include English language support for the high school. That would be creating some additional English language support sections to classes. You can also see that there is a split TSA position that would be supporting both the implementation of the master plan as it's revised, including something called integrated ELD. That TSA position is split with early literacy support as well. It would be sort of a two-role TSA position. Those are the sort of core elements of EL support. It's not insignificant that at Longfellow, the 7-period day would also permit students to both get an EL support class and an elective. And so there are, sort of positive impacts for EL students at Longfellow as a result of that investment as well.
Thank you.
And I think I see, Nicole, I see your hand up.
As always. Okay, so I had 3 questions. I'll just blurt them out. First is, thank you for all the stuff, as always. In general, family engagement, it looks like that program is like tripling or so in size. So,
yeah, the right sort of verb in there is could triple. So remember, these are all ideas right now. So these are, essentially unfunded ideas collected together from a lot of committee input, board input. So the sort of notion here is that this level of expansion, you can see that it's roughly $1 million price tag, would build the OFE team, the Office of Family Engagement and Equity, out to have 1 full-time liaison at every single one of our school sites. And that's roughly doubling the team. It's a little bit more than a 50% expansion of staff. And then there's some additional costs in here that include creating a family engagement specialist. A family education specialist. So this would be somebody to do sort of across the district workshops for families. And then if we built the program out at this scale, it would likely lead to a sort of corresponding change in the administrative title, given that it would be sort of a doubling of the sort of set of responsibilities held by what is right now the coordinator.
Okay, cool. And then my next question was, I can look them both. One is about the SPED section.
Yep.
And a lot of those look like they were one time, though I thought my understanding previously when we talked about those positions, they would be kind of ongoing. And there were some new ones in there. I don't know. I wasn't sure why they were in those buckets. Maybe that's shift in headcount spending. And then the third question was line 81.
Let me take them one at a time.
Right.
So in the category that's called special education, we're right now sort of working on an analysis. It's actually an analysis of projected caseloads over the next 3 years. So we're looking at all of the current caseloads for each of our special education teachers, trying to project ahead at what we anticipate to be growth in those caseloads, and those caseloads are growing each year. And so this is a very preliminary rough out of what might be additional staff expenses in special ed to be able to manage caseloads. Part of what the driver here, although it's not written down, is contractual agreements we entered into 2 years ago to begin to lower our caseloads because we're a full inclusion district. And so there's some, sort of planned expenses in here. And then line 81 is, Pauline, do you mind just scrolling down a little so I can see what it is? The unemployment insurance. So this is, Pauline, you're better at this one than I. We have an increased unemployment insurance rate that we will be required to pay. It's going up pretty dramatically at a total cost of about $1.4 million per year to the district. So that's, yeah.
The only
Pauline,
thing
if you were speaking to that point, you're muted right now.
Sorry. Sorry, I didn't remember I was muted. So yes, so this is a statutory change. It's proposed that we have the COVID funds to cover this as we project this will be a one-time expense. This $1.4 million is the overall impact to all funds and all resources in the district. So it would obviously, meet the requirement. It's one time or proposed one time at this point. If we've determined that it isn't one time, we would then have to include the costs in the out years for each fund and each resource. So again, a very dramatic increase from 0.05%. It's been at that rate forever. But of course, with the COVID and the unemployment, the pressure on the unemployment fund, they're projecting it's going to go to 1.23%.
Pauline, can you clarify, are we anticipating that is a one-time increase in the rate or is an ongoing increase?
We anticipate it's one time at this time. But if it is ongoing, we suspect it will be at a lower rate, and then we would have to include the impact in the out years for each fund and each resource. So
I'm just scanning to see if there's other questions. Everybody doing okay? Looks like.
it's a lot of information. No other questions. So I would like to bring up one. Dan.
Hang on one second. So I didn't see, maybe I just can't find it. Is there any relief for any of the CalSTRS or CalPERS issues?
That's already built into the multi-year. It's actually a carryover from the year before. It is an increase in CalSTRS and CalPERS, but somewhat of a reduced rate. So that's already built into the multi-year plan. The multi-year also shows the anticipated increase in 22-23 or cliff year. We're back up to the regular increases in STRS and PERS. So the increase is usually 1.2 million. In 21-22, it's more like 700,000. It's still an increase, but a lesser increase. But the projected rates for 22-23 are back to their the prior increased rate.
Thank you.
Sure. So I'd like to mention one that I think is pretty important. On line 112, the business enterprise system, ESCAPE, we have 2 one-time buckets and 1 ongoing. So ESCAPE licensing and technical support, where this is the county's system, financial system, and there are a lot of advantages for us going over to that system in terms of us processing our payroll, processing our checks. The county would actually be doing a lot of the processing for us that we now do in-house. Just as a word, to compare it to our existing system, QSS now costs about 100,000. So we're looking at 376 on an ongoing cost. And for the first year, we think we're going to have both systems side by side. In the third year, we would probably do away with $100,000. So it's quite a significant investment, but one that we think the district would benefit from, just in terms of our financial reporting and accountability, and also going, it will assist us in our paperless, our drive to go paperless in terms of processing HR documents and payroll documents. So I just want to put a plug in for that. So any other questions or comments? Oh,
Can I raise my
okay,
hand again?
Nicole and then Robin.
Quick question, hopefully, is I was trying to remember on the various budgets, if there is a plan to replace the Chromebooks that left the sites. Our elementary school, for example, is missing hundreds of Chromebooks, basically. And so
that's in the COVID budget. The planned expenses are not added here. So we have another list of things that are operational, which we can't avoid. This is basically a wish list. But our Chromebooks, we have to pay for those. So that's in our projected expenses for COVID. So.
And Nicole, we are, our new technology director, Max Eisler, is sort of working on buying, sort of in rounds, working on buying new Chromebooks. So we do have 1,500 new Chromebooks arriving by the end of this month that we'll need to then go out and begin to sort of stock the, now emptied Chromebook carts. We will eventually collect in all the Chromebooks that we distributed, try to refurbish them and get them back out if we can. But we're not doing that yet because we're still a little uncertain about whether or not we're going to need them, for the next couple months. And then Robin, over to you.
I just had a quick question about this new enterprise system Escape. Is there a possibility that it will reduce labor costs at some point in the future, in which case it might pay for itself a bit?
Yes, because we won't need as much internal staff for processing and reconciling with the county, would be on the county system. So there will be some efficiencies to be gained. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
But it's just to confirm, it's likely not to take place in the first year or two. Would you say that that's accurate, Pauline?
Correct. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're at 5:29. Let's see.
Pauline, we should congratulate each other. Nobody's asleep, as
I know.
as best I can tell.
Correct. It's a lot of information. Thanks for putting up with us while we presented this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, I think. Well, should I? So everybody should go back to their, where am I? If we go back to the link, to the link that I had shared, we can see the following. I guess we should go all the way down to slide 40. So Brent, do you think we should actually share this link to the the form that we want to get people's feedback at this point? Or how do we think we should, as a process question, how should we actually next steps?
So I think probably we should just talk about sort of scheduling the next meeting. Should I go ahead and just sort of propose what we're thinking to the group?
Yeah, I think it's on the first slide, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're sort of, you're probably gathering that we're sort of getting into the real sort of meat and potatoes of the budget process. We've got lots of sort of substantive conversations in front of us. Our thinking about what lies ahead is essentially to be prepared eventually for the general fund conversation to take place later in May. And that really means beginning to think about ranking some of the high priority spends if they are possible, as well as prepping for cuts that might need to come if we're going to spend some dollars out of the general fund. So rather than sort of introduce a tool for doing that now, just at the last minute as we run out of time, what we would like to propose is that we'd come back together in 2 weeks and not a month. And that we would meet probably, sort of 3 or 4 meetings at an interval of every 2 weeks while we sort of work through what is really the crux of the budget building process. And that I think will put us in really good position to be able to advise, provide advice to me, but also advise the Board of Education as we get to the end of May. So, so I'd say let's hang on to the tool. If we can come together in 2 weeks, we'll introduce the tool and just jump right into that.
Brent, before we wrap up, we did not open the meeting for public comment. And Lindsay Nofeld.
Yeah, let's jump over to Lindsay. Hi, Lindsay.
Hello, I think your only member of the public.
Welcome to you.
Welcome.
I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Lindsay Nofelt. I have a second grader at Cragmont, and I've been really diving deep into the budget and doing a lot of my homework. And I'd just like to give a comment to the SBAC team that when you rank these wish lists for the next coming years, and we consider the $8 million or $9 million cliff that we have, that the LCAP supplemental funds are in deficit, and that if we want to give our teachers a raise, we have to cut too, that we don't really know exactly what's going on with our kids yet. And these funds are supposed to first and foremost support learning loss and support our children. So when you're ranking these funds, please consider putting our children first, and then consider how we can kind of push some of the more flexible and longer term expiration funds a little bit further out so we can decide a little bit later and not in such a rush. And I thank you for hearing me, and thank you for taking my comment.
Thank you, Lindsay. We appreciate you joining us today.
There's nothing better I want to do, of course.
Well, we think this is the best gig and the best entertainment in town. So what we're going to propose to do, we'll sort of reach out to SBAC committee members just to see if we can pull you together in 2 weeks. We'd like to just sort of pick up exactly at this point, having run through lots of background information and updates, to sort of dig back into the sheet, ask questions about programs, and sort of start the ranking process as best that we're able to do it. And that's just kind of, a bird in hand as we get to about mid-May or so and finally turn our attention to the general fund. Does that sound okay, Pauline? We'll just reach out. And Pauline, though, can you just tell folks what we were thinking of, what 2 weeks forward on this day is?
Right, it May 4th. So I think it's the 4th. So we're looking at a meeting on May 4th, and then we're looking another one on the 21st. So Vivian will be sending out the agenda and the meeting requests.
And we're proposing to double everybody's pay for those. I think
that's hilarious.
That is hilarious.
So if I remember correctly, we're on the schedule already for the 18th. So would we do the 4th, the 18th, and the 21st?
Oh, probably it's the 4th and the 18th. I thought, hold on, let me go to
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just, I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, it's the 4th and the 18th. It's the first slide in the topics for this evening. The item 7 has the proposed dates. So
with that, okay. I think we can call it an afternoon. Really appreciate everybody's time today, and we'll see you in 2 weeks, and we'll sort of just pick up where we've left off.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Everybody, see you all. Everyone.
Bye.
That was a lot of information, Ms. Pauline.
Yeah, it was. I know. We sent it out ahead of time, so you could get that reading. Oh, thank you. Okay,
Thank
bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye, Mildred. You take care.
Bye. You too, sir.
Bye, everybody.